So good morning to everybody, and nice to see you all this morning. Today we're going to continue with our talking about the brain. Yesterday we started with a brief overview of the field of neuroscience, and we looked at the cellular level of the nervous system and communication between the brain and the body. And today we're going to go over some brief anatomy of the brain. Yesterday, I was asked to have some resources about the brain, and I've listed here some books that are that I've used before and that I think are very helpful. So if you want to write these down, or just the slides should be available after today, hopefully. These are some good resources. I'll give you a minute to write. Bless you. Yeah, what? Oh, that's right. Sorry. I'll do it there. Flatter is better. Is that good? I don't mind hiding. You guys ready? Are you ready? Just give and one more minute. So today is our election day in the U.S. We're waiting with some anxiety. I didn't think I was thinking about it that much, but I was having bad dreams about it. Okay, can I move on? I also wrote down some useful websites about the brain. So some of these are university sponsored, and others, like the Dana Foundation, have some has a good page that has just some basic resources. One of these has a neuroscience for kids, and has a lot of interesting information on there that's very basic. I know we have an extra lecture on Thursday, and I was thinking maybe we could look at some of these pages then together and go through some of the little things that they have on there. And of course, you can do it on your own too. Okay, you ready to move on? They get the good thumbs up from everybody. Thumbs up from my mom. Okay. Okay, when you talk about anatomy of the body, there is some terminology that is used, and one of the terminology that we use is the planes of the body. So this is if you would cut the body in a certain way and look at it from inside. So the sagittal plane is right down the middle. So that's really the only plane that causes symmetry if you cut it in half. So if you try to remember, you could remember symmetry and sagittal. Both start with S. So that cuts along the midline. The coronal plane is the frontal plane. It divides the anterior and posterior portions. So the coronal plane I always think of as sort of cutting off the face part of your head. A little morbid maybe, but and the transverse, or what we call more commonly in the brain, is the axial cut, and that cuts along the mid plane of the body. So all the planes are perpendicular to each other, And this shows them on the body, but we also use these quite frequently when we talk about the brain. So again, the axial would cut this way. And here in the figure, you can see the ventricles quite clearly in that figure. The coronal plane is basically cutting off the face. So it's the up and down this way. And the sagittal is the symmetric plane of cutting right in half. And of course, these views can be moved. So you could scroll through axial like this, or coronal from front to back, or sagittal from left to right. And these are important when we start looking at imaging, so we can define what direction we're looking at of the brain. Okay, so in directions of the body, we also talk about the brain a lot in terms of medial, ventral, dorsal, anterior, posterior. So I thought we would go through these as well. So in the coronal plane, which is the frontal cutting the face off, you have anterior or ventral, which is the forward direction, and posterior or dorsal, which is the back direction. And in the sagittal plane, which is the symmetric cutting in half plane, you have medial, which brings you close to the middle, and lateral, which is outwards from the middle. In the axial or the transverse plane, which cuts in half at the cross section here, you have the inferior, and which is the down direction, and the superior, which is the up direction. And it's also called cranial and caudal directions that way. And similarly, these are also present when we talk about the brain. So there's the medial and the lateral, the anterior and the posterior, and the, let's see, what did I miss? The, which one am I missing? Inferior and the superior. Does anybody have any questions about those? So that just helps orient to where we are in the brain. Okay, so let's spend a bit of time talking more about the brain itself. The brain is a soft mass of nervous tissue. So as we talked about yesterday, it contains neurons and glial cells. And it has 4 major parts that people like to talk about: the cerebrum, the limbic system in the midbrain, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. And we're going to talk about each of these a little bit more. Okay, the cerebrum is divided into 2 hemispheres. It's the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. So you could slice it down the middle, and those would be the 2 hemispheres of the brain. The 2 hemispheres of the brain actually are separate from each other, and they're connected in the middle by what's called the corpus callosum, which is a large mass of white matter that connects the 2. The cerebrum is the largest and most obvious portion of the brain, and it has these folds in it. So these convoluted ridges or folds are called gyri. Actually, the ridges are called the gyri, and the grooves inside are called the sulci. And it also has larger sectional grooves that are called deep fissures. So the total surface area is about 2.25 meters square. And the reason that we have these ridges and grooves is because it's the surface of the brain that is very important. And as you know, if you take something and you ball it up like a piece of paper, you can fit a much more surface area into a smaller space by kind of crinkling something up and causing it to be folded. So that's the way I think of the brain, trying to get as much surface space as possible into a smaller place. Okay. So again, we have the gyri, which are the ridges that are in the folds, and the sulci, which are the grooves, actually the folded down pieces. There are several fissures or divisions. The central sulcus divides the frontal lobe and the parietal. The fissures are the deep grooves dividing large regions and lobes, and we'll go through each of these a bit more. The longitudinal fissure is what divides the two hemispheres. The transverse fissure separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum in the back. And the lateral fissure divides the temporal and from the frontal and parietal. And like I said, we'll look at these a bit more. Okay. So again, the gyri are the grooved portions. I mean the ridged portions, sorry, and the sulci are the grooves in between. And this is an example of a fissure here. Oops. Did everybody see that? Okay. Okay. So we'll talk a little more about each of the lobes, but right now we're going to focus on the divisions between the lobes. The central sulcus is a fissure that divides the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. The sylvium or lateral fissure divides the parietal and frontal from the temporal. And the transverse fissure here in the back divides the cerebrum of the brain from the cerebellum. And this is the longitudinal fissure that divides the brain into halves. Okay, so we're going to talk a little more about the cerebrum. The outer layer is called the cerebral cortex. And this is what contains an excessive amount of gray matter. These are neurons with unmyelinated axons. And this is an actual one of our brain images that has been divided into tissue types with a processing algorithm that we use when we do our processing of our images. And I just used this here to show you where the gray matter was located. It's 2 to 4 millimeters thick, and it has over 50 billion neurons and 250 billion glial cells. So these glial cells really do dominate the cell content in the brain. And like I said yesterday, their function and purpose has been just not thought too much of, but in recent years, people are looking more into seeing actually what these cells do. Okay, so if you slice, this is a coronal slice here. You can see that the cerebral cortex here is the outer gray matter area. And if you look deeper inside the brain, you see a lot of white matter. And this white matter is the myelinated axons that connect different portions of the cerebral cortex. And here it is again. The thicker inner layer is the white matter. And this is that same brain on the right here, segmented into the white matter now instead of the gray matter. The white matter consists of interconnecting groups of myelinated axons that project between the cortical areas of the cortex. So it's a large connection network that's keeping all the parts of the brains connected. And that's important when we start to talk about functionality, because you'll see that sometimes areas of the brain that aren't necessarily adjacent to each other are still talking to each other and working together. Again, the connection of large white matter between the two brain hemispheres is called the corpus callosum. It's here in the middle. And I don't know if you guys know this commonly or not, but the left side of the cortex controls sensory and motor functions on the right side and vice versa. So the left side of your body is controlled by the right side of your brain, and vice versa. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the lobes of the brain. So there are 4 major lobes of the brain, and the lobes are part of the cerebrum or the cerebral cortex outside. And again, the fissures divide the different lobes, and each of the lobes has a different function. So we're going to start with the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is involved with voluntary movement, planning, reasoning, judgment, and what we call executive functioning. So we're going to talk a little bit more about executive functioning. But this is sort of the part of the brain that does short-term memory, motivation, reward, social functioning, inhibits, crude behavior, or helps us in reasoning out ways to act and ways not to act. It also integrates a lot of the stimuli and helps in emotional regulation and helps us to form memories. So if you look at the frontal lobe there, the first thing past the central sulcus is your motor strip area. That is part of the frontal lobe. And the premotor area is directly in front of that. And up in the way front, in the pink or red areas shown there, is the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is a region that is more developed in humans than in animals. So this is one of the areas that helps differentiate us from other species, because it's much more developed in humans. Okay, here's the frontal lobe again, and there's the central sulcus that divides it from the parietal lobe. Again, let's see. The primary motor cortex is the first strip in front of the central sulcus. And you can see it there in the darker blue. You can also have Broca's area in the frontal lobe. And remember, we talked a little about Broca's area yesterday. That's the area that helps us be able to speak from a standpoint of a motor functioning perspective. So you can see Broca's area is connected to the motor strip there. And the motor strip, again, is what helps us and allows us to regulate our movements, including speech. So the very front of the underneath of the prefrontal cortex is called the orbital frontal cortex. We'll talk a little bit more about this area too. This helps a lot in emotional regulation and helps to regulate a lot of the things that are happening in the midbrain, which we're also going to talk about. And right underneath the orbital frontal cortex is the olfactory bulb. So olfaction is the sense of smell. So interestingly, it's sort of right above our nose there. And one thing about the sense of smell is that we'll learn a little bit more that all the other senses go through the thalamus. The olfactory bulb does not. It's directly above the nose, and it's also involved, which we'll see in a little bit, in the limbic system of the brain, which is why it's thought that when you have a certain smell and it brings back memories, it's because this olfactory system is so closely interrelated to the emotional center of the brain. Okay, we're going to move on to the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe sits right behind the frontal lobe, and it's thought to be involved with the integration of sensory information from different modalities. So we're going to talk about each of the sensory systems a bit in the next lecture. They all seem to come in, and the parietal lobe has a way of putting these together and helping us to make sense of them in an integrated way. It's involved with mapping and coordination, so our spatial mapping and coordination of our motions. The parietal lobe is also thought to be the lobe that enables us to read, write, and solve mathematical problems. So the parietal lobe really is sort of like I said, an integration area. It's sort of a spatial and processing type of area in the brain. Okay, the temporal lobe sits, you have a left and right temporal lobe, and it sits below the parietal and a little bit behind the frontal. The temporal lobe is involved with auditory perception, so with sounds. And again, we'll see it in the next lecture where the sound centers are located and the areas that process the sounds that we hear. So the temporal lobe is important for processing of semantics. Semantics meaning the meaning of speech and the meaning of words. And it's helped in the processing of speech and in vision. The temporal lobe contains part of the hippocampus. The hippocampus is sort of a unique structure that we're going to talk about also today. It helps with memory formation, And some people tend to think that the hippocampus is part of the midbrain, which I believe it also is, but it also extends into the temporal lobe. So the hippocampus plays a key role in the formation of long-term memories. Okay, the occipital lobe sits in the back of the brain, and this contains some of the primary vision centers. It's mostly responsible for visual processing and visual perception, also with spatial processing. And one thing about the occipital lobe that I find quite interesting is that it's mostly involved with visual processing, and it really is one of the only sensory, the vision system has really one of the only senses that has a full lobe devoted to it. So that occipital lobe is a lot of vision processing, like I said, and our brain puts a lot of importance into that. Okay, now we're going to move on to the limbic system, or the midbrain. And I find the limbic system interesting because a lot of the experiments that we do with fear and with emotional processing in fMRI light up the center of the brain. The midbrain or limbic system is located deep inside the brain in the cerebrum, inside the cerebrum. You can see it here in the picture. And the main parts are the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the amygdala, and the hippocampus. Remember, I told you the hippocampus sort of starts in the midbrain and then it comes out into the temporal regions. This is often called the emotional center of the brain. It supports a variety of functions, including emotion, behavior, long-term memory, and olfaction. Remember, I told you the olfactory bulb sort of is at the base here and sticks into the middle, into that midbrain system. Okay, we're going to talk about the parts of the midbrain a bit. The thalamus is a very interesting part of the brain because it's sort of like the cell phone tower of the brain. So all the sensory information, except for olfactory system, comes through this thalamus. So it's sort of a relay center between a variety of subcortical areas in the cerebral cortex. So when sensory information comes in, it goes right to the thalamus. Then the thalamus sort of distributes it to the part of the brain that it needs to go to. So like I said, every sensory system, with the exception of the sense of smell, has a hub in the thalamus, and that receives the sensory signals and sends them to the associated regions. So it kind of gets the information and directs it to where it goes. The thalamus also plays a role in sleep and wakefulness, and we'll talk about sleep in a later lecture a little more. The hypothalamus is a smaller area next to the thalamus. It's a lot of involved in the hormonal functions of the brain. So one thing that the brain does that we won't talk about a whole lot is that it helps to regulate the endocrine system of the body. So these are the endocrine system. I tend to think of as sort of a chemical communication system that the brain helps to regulate. So you release hormones into the body depending on what's going on, and the regulation is also controlled by the brain and the hypothalamus. So instead of communicating in an electrical way, this is sort of a chemical communication system in the brain. So the hypothalamus is thought to be related to temperature regulation, water and nutrient balance, thirst and hunger, sleep and wake patterns, which are called circadian rhythms, which are the ones that sort of keep us in the rhythm of going to bed at night and waking up in the morning, sort of the ones that get shaken up with jet lag. So when we were traveling here, I kept telling my parents our circadian rhythms are being sort of shaken around and readjusted. And fortunately, our brains are quite adaptive, so it has the ability to adapt to new situations. So otherwise, I think I would probably be sleeping right now, maybe, or getting ready for bed. Okay, the hypothalamus also is involved in hunger and food intake and a lot of the hormonal control of the body. The amygdala is one of my favorite parts of the brain because This is an area that lights up in imaging very well to any kind of emotional stimuli. You have two amygdala, a right and a left amygdala, and it's involved in the expression of fear and fear conditioning, expression of pleasure. It's positively correlated to size, in size to aggression level. So it's thought the more aggressive you are, the bigger your amygdala. It's also linked to phobias, and it's one of the sort of the primary regions of the brain. So the cerebral cortex area is more of a higher developed area, whereas the midbrain has a lot of our sort of primal functions, and the amygdala is one such area with emotions and telling us when we need to be afraid, sort of associating different things with fear and keeping us on our toes, so to speak. Okay, the hippocampus. The hippocampus is that structure that I told you that starts in the midbrain and sort of comes out into the temporal lobes. You have two hippocampi, a left and a right. It's a key player in memory and in spatial navigation. It also helps with emotions, and again, it's located partly in the medial temporal lobe. Okay, the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia is an interesting area. It's more such of a group of neurons that lie deep within the brain than it is a structure in the brain. And you can divide this basal ganglia into two regions, the dorsal, which means the higher up, and the ventral, which means the lower down areas. And you can see in the top slice there, this is what it looks like sort of in an imaging type of study. And in the bottom slice there, it segments out the different regions. So I thought both of those were a little bit useful, because if you just look at the top figure, it's hard to make out where the structures of these things lie. So in the dorsal region of the basal ganglia, we also call this area the striatum. And it's part of the midbrain system. The dorsal striatum contains the caudate and the putamen, and you have a left and right of each of these. The ventral striatum contains the nucleus accumbens and part of those olfactory regions that we talked about. And in this top slice to the right here, you can see, if you would take an axial part of this out and look at it, you can see the different cells there, which contain it's the red nucleus of the thalamus and some what's called the substantia nigra. These regions are important because they're involved in the reward system of the brain. So when we do fMRI tasks that involved, we often do fMRI tasks that involve winning and losing, sort of to look at the reward systems, and these systems really light up the caudate and the putamen, especially the caudate. So if we have a person that's winning money or thinking that they're winning money, this area of the brain lights up quite well. Okay, we're going to keep talking about the striatum and the basal ganglia. Again, this is now from an axial view of it. You can see the putamen here and the caudate. The caudate is sort of a looped structure, and it has a head and a tail region. And the left and the right of these are divided by white matter. And the ventral in the bottom is the nucleus accumbens, like I mentioned, and the olfactory bulb, which, if I had a pointer, I could show you again, sits at the bottom of the prefrontal cortex. And this is just driving the point home. Another view of it, showing the basal ganglia in the amygdala bodies, which are in the purple there. And let's see, the caudate, which is the red area right underneath the ventricles. So the fluid areas in the brain are called the ventricles, and the caudate nucleus, the left and the right, sit right under those ventricles. And again, this is just showing you again from a different view of the midbrain structures. The ventral tegmental area is important because this is also involved a lot in the reward system. It is one of the origin of the dopaminergic cell bodies. So yesterday we talked a little bit about the neurotransmitter dopamine. This dopamine transmitter helps us in movements and coordination. It's also involved quite a bit in the reward centers of the brain. So the ventral tegmental area is a group of neurons that sits sort of on the floor of the midbrain here. Hopefully you can see it, the VTA area there. And we'll see that again when we talk about reward systems in the brain. Okay, the brainstem. The brainstem connects the brain with the spinal cord. And we don't look at this area a lot in functional MRI because this is sort of an area that's involved with the autonomic nervous system. It helps us automatically control vital functions like breathing, and this goes on without us consciously thinking of it. So of course, if you focus on your breathing, you can regulate it yourself, but as soon as you lose that focus, you don't stop breathing, thankfully, thanks to the brainstem and the functions that it does. So we can divide the brainstem into 3 regions: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. So we're going to talk briefly about each of these. The midbrain of the brainstem is the top portion. So it connects the pons, which is the middle portion of the brainstem, to the cerebellum and the cerebrum, and it's located at the upper end of the brainstem. The midbrain of the brainstem is involved with visual reflexes, movements of the eyes, focusing of the lenses, and dilation of the pupil. So again, in these autonomic functions that keep on going even though we're not consciously aware of them. The pons is the mid portion of the brainstem. It's the rounded bulb between the midbrain and the medulla oblongata, which is the bottom portion of the brainstem. And this functions with the medulla oblongata to control respiratory functioning. And again, the medulla oblongata is this bottom portion of the brainstem, and it's shown there in sort of the lighter or teal blue color. It's the lowermost portion of the brainstem. It connects the pons, which is again the mid portion of the brainstem, to the spinal cord. And the medulla oblongata is very important. It contains vital centers that regulate heart rate, respiratory, constriction and dilation of blood vessels, blood pressure, swallowing, vomiting, sneezing, and coughing. So a lot of these, again, the autonomic functions that we have that go on all the time. Okay, the cerebellum is that little area in the back, and it's the word cerebellum itself is Latin for little brain. So it's the second largest part of the brain, and it processes sensory information. It's involved with coordinating skeletal muscle contractions and voluntary motor movement. And it's also involved with processing of coordination, balance, body positioning, and timing of movements. One interesting thing about the cerebellum is that it's not well understood in terms of functioning. So it's also another area that's becoming more popular in research and trying to understand what exactly it does in helping us to function. And an interesting thing is a lot of other animals have larger cerebellums than we do. So that's a lot why it's thought to be controlled with movements. So for example, cats have a large cerebellum area, and they're able to do the fine motor movements very well. So that's one reason why it's thought to be involved with that. Okay, we're going to talk about how our brain is protected. So inside, of course, the brain, we have this fluid. It's the cerebral spinal fluid, and that is sort of the fluid that acts as a shock absorber and stops our brain from bumping around in the cell. So that's in very close to the brain next to it. Then we have 3 layers of meninges. These are membranes of protective tissue with cerebral spinal fluid between each layer. And this also helps to act as a shock absorber to protect the brain. The meninges is also rich with blood vessels that help to feed the brain. And there's, I don't know if you've ever heard of the blood-brain barrier, but the meninges contain this blood, and they only let certain chemicals pass into the brain and keep other chemicals out of the brain. And of course, lastly is the skull, which is your big hard noggin part of your head. It protects our brain from injuries and bumps. Without it, the brain and the soft tissue would damage very easily. So you can see we have quite an elaborate protection system for the brain. Okay, this picture here at the bottom left is that same brain I showed you, which we showed you segmented into gray matter and white matter. This is the segmented part of the cerebral spinal fluid. So you can see, again, it's largely around the head and inside the head in these ventricular areas. And on the figure on the right here, you can see the ventricles. The cerebral spinal fluid, or the CSF, is a clear, colorless body fluid that occupies the subarachnoid space. So that's these spaces where there's no tissue and just this fluid are also often called subarachnoid space. And the ventricular system around and inside the brain. So you can see here in the picture on the right that you have quite a bit of area that just has fluid in it in the brain. So those are the larger ventricles in the middle, and that's when you look at a slice of brain in the axial direction that you see those ventricles there. You also have a third and a fourth ventricle that's sort of further back into the brain. And the spinal fluid, cerebral spinal fluid, as you can probably guess from the name, goes all the way down into the spinal cord and helps keep all of that area bathed in moisture and nutrients. Okay, the main functions of the cerebral spinal fluid are, one is buoyancy. So it allows the brain to maintain its density without being impaired by its own weight. So your brain's kind of sort of just floating around in this spinal fluid, and it's keeping it from just being too heavy for, the neck and the body. It's also for protection, like I mentioned before. So it sort of helps us swish the brain around. If you hit your head, you're not directly damaging the nervous tissue of your brain. It also helps for chemical stability. So your brain does a lot of metabolic processing, which we'll see later, and that's part of the reason that we can study it, because we can see these metabolic processes with certain types of imaging techniques. So this processing, though, produces waste products from the use of energy in the head, and this cerebral spinal fluid helps to rinse those waste products, and then it can pass them out through the meninges and the blood-brain barrier to get rid of them so they don't build up in the head. And the CSF also prevents brain ischemia. So it decreases the total intracranial pressure by reducing fluid levels when necessary and facilitates blood perfusion. So if your brain is maybe, if you hit your head and have a brain injury or something, it swells, and the cerebral spinal fluid will help adjust the pressure levels in the head so you don't get too much pressure built up in there. So in summary, we talked about the anatomical directions of the body and the brain. We talked about the main parts of the brain and the 4 lobes. And we talked a lot about the midbrain and the brain protection through the meninges and the spinal cord. So 2 things that I don't have in here that I wanted to mention were injuries involving the anatomical injuries of the brain. So you all probably heard the term meningitis. And this is when actually the meninges of your brain swell up. So itis is basically swelling of something. So meningitis would be the swelling of those meninges. And so it's not actually your brain that swells. It's these meninges that swell, and that, of course, increases the pressure of your head, which can lead to a lot of negative symptoms. If the swelling of the brain itself is called encephalitis, so that is also a quite serious condition, and it can be caused by a number of different things. So I just wanted to make the distinction between meningitis and encephalitis, often caused by a virus or bacteria. Okay, so that's all I have for the anatomy of the brain. We could keep going, or we could take our break a little early and start the next lecture afterwards. Yeah, anybody have any questions? Yes. It's part of the midbrain and part of the cortex itself. Oh, like does it come before, like, as sort of as from a developmental standpoint? Yeah, that's a great question. I would guess it would be. Yeah. We have, compared to other animals, we have a very underdeveloped sense of smell. So it does, yeah, you're completely right, because this visual system is more of a, in terms of evolution or in terms of development of the species, it's a newer part of the system than the olfactory system, because all those midbrain structures are sort of the early types of development, sort of our basic reflex system that most animals also have. So I think you're probably right. I could look into that a little more for you if you'd like, and let you know. So some other animals have olfaction systems with a lot more area than we devote to it. Just because, and that might be evolutionary as well, just because we devote more sensation to vision and hearing than we do to smell. Yes?
You showed one area of the brain that controls reasoning, like mathematics.
Yeah.
Another controls emotional things.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some people are very skilled at reasoning and others aren't.
Yes.
Some people are very emotional and others aren't.
Yes.
Is that part of the brain on some of them bigger than the others, or can you tell why some person would be very good at reasoning and others not, and some?
That's a good question too. He asked if parts of the brain are bigger in some people, if they have better skills in an area, and not necessarily. So the size isn't always coordinated with functional levels. People spend a lot of time trying to understand why people have different sizes of brains. So I tend to think that it's more of refined connections between different systems rather than the size itself. But there are some studies, like I mentioned with the amygdala, that the bigger amygdala you have, the more aggressive you are. Not everybody's studies show that, but some people's do. So there's a lot of variability in studies with sizes of parts of the brain. Does that answer? Yes? No, it's fine.
Sizes of the brains can be different, as you mentioned.
Yes.
Does it mean that the number of neurons in the brain is different within some variability, or is it anatomical differences within across individuals in the neuron cells themselves? That accounts for.
So he asked if the sizes are because of the number of neurons in each region. That I'm not sure of. I would say yes, but I'm not sure. But I can look into that too and let you know. That's a great question.
And related question would be any kind of quantitative measure of variability or variation in the number of neurons.
Yeah. I can look into that and let you know as well. That's a very good question. Sure. Yes.
As you said, it can be more like
Correct. Yes.
for the sensory information.
Hmm.
And there are various other centers like hippocampus and other centers which are like related with memory.
Yes.
So can it say that the processing of sensory information which plays some role with the memory formation, is all the memory formation being controlled by the center?
Memory formation is controlled a lot by the hippocampus, but also the thalamus relays information. And the really cool thing about the brain is that these regions all work together. So I don't believe the thalamus is involved that much in memory, but it certainly is involved with placing spatial information and sensory information in locations, and then if we find this information important enough, then we start developing a memory of it. Does that answer your question? Okay, sure. Yes.
You mentioned that the frontal lobe handles reasoning and motivation,
Correct.
but the parietal lobe handles problem solving.
Yes.
What exactly is the distinction that you?
So I think the parietal lobes handles this problem solving more without I think the frontal lobe is more involved with regulation of a lot of the different sensory and processing information, whereas the parietal lobe itself is involved with sort of spatial and reasoning structures. So the frontal lobe is also involved with that, but it also is more involved with executive functioning, as in it's the top boss basically. So, the processes that go on throughout the brain can be regulated more by this frontal lobe. So, does that answer your question? Okay. They work together.
So I don't remember exactly which ones, but I came across some studies recently that said with regards to high functions, there's only a certain limit to which you can localize these functions to various places. So how specified can you go?
That's a good question too. So how much can you localize a function to a region? You know, as long as I've worked in fMRI, I think it's very difficult to localize a specific function to a region. When you study a specific process, there's so many areas of the brain that light up, and there's some that we expect to light up. So if we do an emotional processing task, for example, we expect the amygdala to light up. We expect some of the orbital frontal cortex to light up. But then you also see other regions lighting up, and it's quite variable between different people. And so I think functional MRI is quite limited in the ability to tell you exactly what's happening and exactly, what all the processing of the brain is doing. So like I said, there's areas that we expect to light up, and they typically do. If they don't, we say, uh-oh, something's wrong with this data. But it is quite limited in the ability to see what's going on in the brain in a very detailed level. Because one, we have spatial limitations. We can only see down to a certain size. And two, we have, which you'll learn later, we have time constraints, because you sort of trade off the spatial for the time. So it's sort of a trade-off. We don't get a lot of time or temporal information from fMRI. So does that answer your question? It's pretty limited, I think. It's sort of a chunky method, I think of it like. So we can't really get refined to look at those areas. We need some better technology is what I think. So if you guys are really clever, you could come up with a new technology that'll allow us to see more detailed of exactly what's going on in the brain. Yes.
I know that fMRI scanners are huge pieces of equipment.
Yes.
Is it somehow possible to combine EEG and fMRI together in some way? Is it possible?
Yes, this is a really good question, and people are trying to do this. So he's asking if we can combine EEG with fMRI, and people really do try to do this. I remember, well, there's some limitations though. First of all, you can't put anything metal really in the scanner, and we'll talk about safety in another lecture, but the metal heats up. I remember when I was a graduate student and somebody was playing around with this EEG in the fMRI machine, and they had a graduate student get in there, and he had an electrode on his head, and it burned a big hole in his forehead because it heated up while he was in there, and he didn't really notice. So that's one problem with using electrodes in the scanner. A second problem is that you have a lot of noise, electromagnetic noise from the machine itself. So it's hard to get the true EEG signal out of that noise. But people are definitely trying to do that, and if you could get a nice clear signal, that would really start helping, I think, put together the pieces of what's happening spatially with what's happening on a time scale level. Correct. Right. EEG is to the milliseconds of temporal resolution, right? So it's very good at that. But fMRI, you're quite limited by how fast you can make the scanner go. So. And of course, you need statistical information for fMRI. So just a single time recording doesn't give you much. Any more questions? Yes. Ah, that's a great question. They are finding a lot of differences between male and female brains. In the past, a lot of the studies for fMRI have focused on one gender, and when we do that, it's typically males. And I don't know about here, but in the US, our government starts pushing for inclusion of minorities and looking at both males and females when you're doing your experiments. So there are definite differences between male and female brains. They're subtle, but they are there. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Is that right? Should we take a break and then come back? If anybody has any questions you want to come up and ask me, you know. Right, during the break, feel free to. Are we a little early on our break? Okay. Okay. And when we come back, we're going to start talking about functional systems of the brain. Start at 11. Yeah. Is that good for everybody? Okay. Okay, for the second part of the class today, we're going to talk about the mapping of function to structure. So in our previous lesson, we talked a lot about the anatomy of the brain, which is basically the structure of the brain, what the tissue is, where it's located, and you know what it's thought to be involved in. So now we're going to look at where in the brain do different functions live. Okay, so we're going to talk about the functional organization of the brain, and these are the anatomical regions of the brain that work together for functioning and behavior. So they're often linked through bundles of nerve fibers or white matter tracts, and of course the white matter tracts being that area inside the brain with all those myelinated axons. But they're not always linked together by anatomically located next to each other. So we're going to talk a little bit about the sensory systems, because a lot of the brain is devoted to these sensory systems and processing senses and integrating them together to create an environment that makes sense to us in our brains. So we're going to talk about vision and the optical system, hearing, which is the auditory system, touch, which is the sensory system, and with touch sort of goes the motor system. And we're going to talk about taste, which is called gustation, and smell, which is, we talked a little bit about, which is the olfactory system. And also, after, when we're done talking about the senses, we're going to talk a little bit about some of these other systems. So the brain really has a large amount of things that it does and regions that work together. For example, speech and language. So we hear, and then we process, and then we respond with speech. So there's a system that allows us to do that in a fluent manner. We're going to talk a little bit about the reward system in the brain, and we're going to talk a little bit about executive cognitive functioning. And I know I mentioned executive functioning before, and this is a lot of the higher order prefrontal cortex part of the brain that distinguishes us from other species. We're going to talk about attention, inhibition, emotions, emotional regulation, and a little bit about the fear network of our brain that keeps us in check with our environment. So sort of keeps us from doing foolish things or dangerous things. We're going to talk a little bit about memory. We're not going to talk about resting state networks today, but we're going to talk about those in another lecture. Functional systems of the brain are, like I mentioned, they're integrated. They integrate information. And although they have spatial locations in the brain where different things are processed, none of these systems exist exclusively or independently. For example, maybe when you go to breakfast in the morning, you see the food, you can smell the food. You hear the people talking around and saying, would you like some juice? Would you like this or that? Or of course, if you're at the hotel like we are in the morning, but of course at home, you have your different things going on, but it's all integrated together to give us this very fluent environment that we see. Functional connections in the brain are the connections that keep these anatomical regions working fluently together. So like I mentioned, sometimes they're connected by a piece of tissue or nerves or white matter tracts. For example, Broca's area and Wernicke's areas that we talked about yesterday, the production of speech and the ability to understand and use appropriate words. These areas are connected by a large bundle of nerve fibers called I think it's the arcuate fasciculus. And you can see in the picture there, this depiction of the nerve fibers on the left that keep these two areas connected so that they can work very quickly together. On the right side is a picture of white matter tracts. And these white matter tracts are that white part that I showed you inside the brain. And the picture you're seeing there is an image of a newer technology called diffusion tensor imaging. And this is sort of a tractography type of imaging, and we're going to talk about it more in a later lecture. But it's a very new technique that allows people to see these connections between the brain and these white matter tracts. They make some beautiful pictures with them. Okay, let's start by looking at the visual system. So as I mentioned, the visual system is a lot of processing in the occipital cortex. It's the system, a sensory system that is, the brain has the largest devoted area to. So it's a very important system for us. The pathway from the retina to the cortex ends in the primary visual cortex. So you can see back there in the occipital lobe, this is an axial slice through the brain. And your primary visual cortex is right back here in your occipital lobe. So the rods and the cones in the retina convert light signals to neural signals. And I find this very fascinating. Each of our sensory systems have some kind of information that they convert into neural signals, and there's not much really understanding of how this is done. So we see light, and it's reflected on the back of our lenses in our eyes, and somehow this light is converted to nerve impulses, which are then sent, as you can see here, through the optic chiasm, and back, it goes through the thalamus, and back to the primary visual cortex. And the left eye goes to the right brain, and the right eye goes to the left brain. Another interesting thing is, if you know how lenses work, you know that the image is inverted. And so we actually see an inverted image that is on the back of our retina, and the brain itself inverts this image. They've done some experiments where they give people, they're called upside down glasses, and have them wear them. So you see the world inverted, and if you keep these glasses on for a while, like maybe a couple days, they claim that your brain will invert them, the images again, so that you actually see right side up. So it's really interesting how the brain can adapt and, like I said, make sense of what we see in the environment and put this information together in a way that we can use and make sense to us. So I like to think that the world is just what your brain sees, and maybe we all see something different, who knows? But we assume we all see the same thing. So maybe green to somebody is not green to somebody else. So just a thought. So the primary visual cortex, like I said, that's the first place that these visual nerve impulses go. This is a highly specialized region for processing information about static and moving objects. It's excellent in pattern recognition. It contains a number of specialized regions that process things such as color, spatial information, depth, texture, and motion. And you can see the primary visual cortex is that little darker area in the back of the brain. I think all of the sensory information parts of the brain also have a secondary processing place. So the primary visual cortex is surrounded by the secondary visual cortex. And you can see the lighter red picture there. It says the visual association cortex. So after the information gets to the primary visual cortex, it then goes to this visual association cortex, and this is the area which interprets what the primary visual cortex sees, and then decides where in the brain it should pass the information to. So the secondary visual cortex is thought to have these what and where pathways, and this is how it decides where it sends the next part of the processing of the information to. So parietal, so people know these from lesions, that, people have a lesion and they look at, again, like we talked about yesterday, what a person is missing if they have an injury in part of the brain. So they found that if you have a lesion in the parietal lobe, this leads to deficits in spatial orientation and attention. So the parietal lobe is thought to be the where pathway. So you see the visual information and you want to orient yourself to where you are. So it goes to this parietal lobe. And like I mentioned, the parietal lobe is a lot of spatial processing and the integration of the where information. The what pathway is thought to go to the temporal lobe, which is down here, these two lobes on the sides of your brain. And this is thought to help you distinguish what something is, and not necessarily where. So where and what. So patients with temporal lobe lesions are aware that there's a problem, and they can develop strategies to compensate for it. However, interestingly, they think that parietal patients are often unaware of their deficits. And that's sort of like what we saw with the Wernicke's area. The guy was just talking, and he I don't think he realized that he wasn't using words correctly because the part of his brain that makes sense of those words isn't really working correctly. Okay, so that's the visual system. Next, we're going to talk about the auditory system, which of course begins at the ears. The ear has three parts: the outer ear, which collects the sound waves. So you have this convenient little cupped area that can collect sound waves coming from different places. The middle ear, which represents the sound waves as pressure. So we get the sound waves, and if you've studied signal processing, you know that sound waves are sort of waves that propagate through the air in a pressure type of way. And this goes to the middle ear, where they're representing the sound waves as pressure. And then this pressure gets to the inner ear, where these signals are converted into electrical signals that the brain perceives as sound. So this happens in the cochlea in the ear. So this is another one of those really amazing places where we take sound information and process it into neural signals that the brain can interpret. After those are converted to neural signals, the information goes through the thalamus again, or through our little relay center, and it goes to the primary auditory cortex. And you can see in the picture there, the primary visual cortex are located in the temporal lobes, and they do the basic processing of the sounds that we hear, and which involves a lot of the pitch and the volume of the noises that we hear. After the primary visual cortex, it goes to the secondary, after the primary auditory cortex, then the information travels to the second auditory cortex, where perception of sounds takes place. So we hear everything, it's processed in the primary place, and then we perceive it as it moves out throughout the brain and starts to get processed. Secondary auditory cortex is thought to be involved with the processing of harmonics, melodies, and rhythmic patterns. And once the sound is in the secondary auditory cortex, it then goes to the speech and language centers of the brain, which we talked about yesterday. So from the auditory centers, information travels to speech and language processing for further understanding of what these sounds are. So again, Broca's area is necessary for production of motor skills. Wernicke's area is involved in comprehension or understanding of the written word. And you can see Broca's area is up there in the frontal cortex, right on the base, sort of on the downside of the motor strip. And that makes sense because that's a motor area of the brain. Wernicke's is more back in the parietal lobe, which is part of the sort of the understanding of things in the putting together of things that come into the brain. Okay, we're going to go on to the somatosensory system, which is the touch. Neurons in the peripheral nervous system receive information from the skin, bones, joints, and other locations. These signals are sent through the spinal cord, and of course they go through the thalamus and into the primary sensory cortex. So you can see the primary sensory cortex is a strip across the brain here, and it's right behind the motor cortex. So while the motor cortex is in the frontal lobe, the sensory cortex is in the parietal lobe. And again, the left side of the body goes to the right brain and vice versa. So you can see this picture here, which shows a sensation in the skin. It's sent as a nerve impulse up through the spinal cord, and it passes through the medulla oblongata in the spinal cord and through the thalamus and into the sensory cortex. And as with the other regions, we have a primary somatosensory cortex, and it's the receptor area for touch. And you can see it here in the lighter blue. And then we have a secondary somatosensory cortex, which helps to, again, integrate the information and helps us to make sense of it. And that is located in the parietal lobe. So you can sort of see that how things are all sort of coming together in the parietal lobe, and which is doing the amazing job of making a visual world for us and a sound world and a touch world that we can relate to. So I mentioned that the somatosensory cortex was right behind the motor cortex, and this allows for very fast responses because the regions are located adjacent to one another. So here's another one of those figures where we see what this path might look like, and again, so you might, the water might be too hot, so instead of leaving your hand there to get burned, you get an immediate sensory signal that's goes up to the sensory cortex, and then your motor cortex acts and says, pull your hand away. So it allows for very fast responses to pain or unpleasant stimuli. So while we're talking about the somatosensory cortex, we're going to talk a little bit about the motor cortex too, because these two regions work so closely together. So the primary motor cortex generates nerve impulses to execute movement. And like I've said probably about 10 times today, the left brain controls right body and vice versa. So this goes on through all of your sensory systems and motor systems. In your primary motor cortex, as similar to the sensory motor cortex, every part of the body is represented. So every part of the body is represented in the feeling sensations and in the ability to then control or regulate these areas through movement. I don't know if you guys have ever seen this guy on the left, but he's called the homunculus. And he's very odd looking, you can see. But he is a figure of what our brain sees. So the parts of him that are bigger have the larger representation in the brain. So you can see our brain puts a lot of information into what's going on in our hands, in sensation and in motor, also in the tongue and the face area. So if you think about your fingers, how sensitive they are compared to something like your back. So if somebody was touching somewhere on your fingers, you might know exactly where, whereas if something was going on your back, you might not have as much descriptive information to say about it. So you can see the blue part, it represents the sensory cortex, and the red part here represents the motor cortex. And you can see where the different parts of the body are allocated. So, and if you look closely enough, you can see there's a face there and part of the body there going down to the toes. And this again is how much space is dedicated to each of these regions in the brain. So we really get a lot of space dedicated to the face also. As with all the other systems, there is also a secondary motor cortex adjacent to the primary motor cortex. This is regions that are helped with planning. So in the posterior parietal cortex, not directly directly adjacent to the primary motor cortex, but it's adjacent to the sensory cortex. This parietal region helps us visually plan our spatial movements, what we're going to do next, where we're going to put ourselves, what we're going to do, helps us orient spatially when we're going to pick something up. And the supplementary motor cortex sits right in front of the primary motor cortex. And this is also an area that's thought to be involved in planning and coordinating complex movements. The premotor cortex, which sits to the sides of the supplementary motor cortex, is thought to be involved with sensory guidance and control more of the trunk areas of the body. Okay, now we're going to move on to taste. Again, this is one of those fascinating places where we have taste buds on the tongue. They detect a sort of a chemosensory sort of detection system, and then these are converted to electrical impulses that the brain can interpret. So the tongue does this conversion and then sends up the signals into the gustatory cortex. And you can see where it is there on the brain. It's sort of close to the auditory cortex. There's a little fold inside your brain that is called the insula. It's the insular fold, and it actually allows for more surface area in the brain. Can you see the little folds in here, in there? The insular region, and part of the gustatory cortex is contained in that region. The insula is an interesting area. It also lights up a lot to fear stimuli, and it lights up to sort of disgust things. So if you say yuck or feel disgusted with something, the insular cortex tends to light up in this area. So I find it really interesting that it's related to taste, because as you know, sometimes you taste something you don't like and it's immediately yuck. So when you do this, you can just kind of picture your insula lighting up in there. Well, I do. Probably not everybody does. Okay, the olfactory system, which we talked about briefly, is unique because it does not go through the thalamus. Instead, it goes through the nose, and this is also a chemosensory system. So we have smells, and the input is then converted again to electrical impulses and sent through the olfactory bulb into the brain, into the part of the limbic system. And this sort of gives a detailed picture of the receptors that are going on. It's not my area of specialty, but you can see it looks pretty complicated how we convert those tastes to impulses. Yes?
How that taste of a substance or a food is based upon both an olfactory system as well as
That's very, very correct. In fact, I have a slide, the next one, showing how these two are related, because they are both chemosensory systems. And you're exactly right. The smell of foods also helps us, with our taste too. So these two systems are very related to each other. So after we have the sense of smell, it goes to the primary olfactory cortex. So the information travels through the olfactory tract towards the primary olfactory cortex in the limbic system. And this transfers the information to the thalamus, hypothalamus, amygdala, hippocampus, into the orbital frontal cortex. So we have some different processing areas for our sense of smell. And again, it's linked into this emotional center of the brain. So that's, again, like I said before, a lot of times you'll smell something and it makes you sort of nostalgic maybe for something in the past, or brings back memories for you. Okay, and like you mentioned, the smell and taste often go together. So they're both a chemosensory system. The olfactory bulb shares an area, like I said, associated with emotions and memory. And the thalamus integrates this with, it integrates the taste with the other sensory input too. The orbital frontal cortex also is involved in integrating the sense of smell and taste. So we saw that part of our smell system goes right into the orbital frontal cortex, which again is at the bottom of the prefrontal cortex here. And these areas also go together in helping us to put together the smell and taste. So you really can see how everything is very integrated in the brain, and how none of these sensations exist uniquely. Okay, so in summary of the sensory systems, mostly in the occipital, parietal, and temporal lobes for the main touch, vision, and hearing. And then you also have the smelling and the touch, the taste sensation You can see where each of those is labeled in the brain. And it's this integration of information, like I mentioned, that makes us aware of our surroundings and helps us to make a complete picture of the universe around us. Okay, we're going to go talk a little bit more about the different areas, some of the different functional areas of the brain and where they live. So speech and language, we've sort of driven home this Broca and Wernicke area. I know you've seen it many, many times already. These are these areas of speech and language. And there's also an area called the angular gyrus, which is associated with perceiving, with making words that we see make sense. And we can, so if you see a word, you can picture what it is in your head if you know what it is. Like maybe table, and you can picture that in your head, and it's thought to be of this angular gyrus region, which I believe is sort of located behind Wernicke's area. Wernicke's is the darker orange, and so all these areas are sort of adjacent to each other for speech and language. Okay, the reward system is one of the areas that keeps us motivated. So it's responsible for incentives, desires, pleasure, and positive reinforcement. And this is a big dopamine system in the brain, and the midbrain system is a big player in this type of the reward system. So you can see here this ventral tegmental area that I mentioned when we were looking at the anatomy, which is a group of neurons that lies on the base of the midbrain, sort of on the floor of the midbrain. This area produces a lot of the dopamine neurons and the dopamine neurotransmitter that we use, and it then sends up into the amygdala, which helps us associate reward with emotions. So, like I mentioned, we see these when people win money, their caudate lights up, which is also in this midbrain area, in the striatum. But the amygdala helps us to feel excited and happy about it. And it also goes up into the prefrontal cortex, which helps us with judgment and willpower. So, reward is always a good thing, but we don't want to overdo it, or if we had no regulation, we would maybe just want to sit around and feel good and have our brains feel rewarded all the time. And the nucleus accumbens also in the midbrain is responsible for this. And as I mentioned, this is the mesolimbic dopamine pathway involving the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens. Also the prefrontal cortex, amygdala, and the hippocampus. So the hippocampus, of course, is involved in memory. And it's also thought to be associated with contextual cues and with the sensation of euphoria that you get sometimes when something is really wonderful and you just love it and it feels rewarding to you. So the reward system is also a system that's highly studied when people are looking at drug abuse, because many of the drugs that people take mimic the effects of a neurotransmitter and can often give this continual rewarding feeling to the people who are taking it. So if you look at the picture there, you can see different drugs work on different neurotransmitters, and they all can tap into this reward system and make somebody feel rewarded or feel good without actually having to do something that really would make you feel good or feel rewarded, like, for example, exercise. So drugs can tap into the brain's communication system and interfere with the normal processing. And other drugs can flood the reward system with dopamine, and it just gives you this the overall good feeling that people can experience. And again, it gives you the feeling of reward and well-being without actually having to do any work for it. So this is also one reason why some drugs are so addicting, because becomes a behavior that people want to feel over and over again, and then it becomes reinforced in the brain. So this is one of the problems again. And a lot of people do study drug abuse. I don't know about here, but in the US, they do. We often have problems with that in our society. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the sensory systems which live parietal, temporal, occipital, and we've talked a little bit about the frontal lobe, but not a whole lot. So the frontal lobe, again, is our more developed system that makes us unique compared to animals, and it contains this executive functioning, which is involved in reward, attention, short-term memory, planning, and motivation. And it plays into these other systems. For example, if something you do helps you feel rewarded in your midbrain, then it motivates you to do it again. So when we talk about the brain in studying it, we often talk about top-down processing versus bottom-up processing. So bottom-up processing refers to processing of sensory information as it comes in. So this is some emotion and fear processing because it's coming up through the midbrain, and these are things that are externally driven by our environment. So the bottom-up processing is thought to be more of a primitive system in the brain that runs a lot on instinct. So animals also have this midbrain system that kind of works the same way as ours, but in our uniqueness, we also have this top-down modulation. So this top-down modulation refers to the perception that's driven by our cognition about what we already know. So it helps us use memories and different types of behavioral control to do this executive functioning. And these things are internally driven, not so much externally driven by the environment. So maybe you see some kind of stimuli in the environment and you know it's bad for you. So that's where your top-down modulation comes in and says, no, I don't want to do something that's bad for me. Or maybe not, depending on the person, I suppose. But that's the difference between top-down and bottom-up. So, and when we do fear learning, fear acquisition, we consider to be a bottom-up process. And it's this top-down control that helps us rationalize our fears and actually say, okay, we know we're afraid of this, but it's not really something that's going to harm us. For example, in the case of phobias and things like that. Okay, so here's an example of top-down versus bottom-up. Okay, so when we look at this, what do we see? Just sort of some lines on a page. But if we start adding additional information in, then we could possibly see it as the letter B, or we could see it as the number 13. So our top-down is helping us make sense of what we see and put it together with other contextual cues. Okay, so the executive cognitive functioning, which is a top-down process, as I mentioned before, it's a set of cognitive processes that involved attentional control, inhibitory control, emotional regulation, working memory, problem solving, planning, and effort. So we're getting all the sensational and sensory information that's coming up, and then our cognitive control is sort of allowing us to act appropriately in response to that. So if you remember old Phineas Gage, who had the rod through his head, he destroyed a lot of the cells in the frontal cortex that are responsible for this executive cognitive functioning. So if you lose that, you sort of become an unregulated person who's just will say anything, or sort of like what we might call a loose cannon in the in the U.S. So this executive cognitive functioning is essential for aspects of daily living. Helps us to interact socially with other people and appropriately, helps us to stay on task and on target. We know if we have work to do and we'd much rather be out playing, our executive functioning system kicks in and says, well, if you're going to spend the day playing, you're going to lose your job, then you're not going to have any money, and then you'll be in a bad way. So thankfully, we have this executive processing that keeps us in check. And this is mostly contained in the prefrontal cortex, which is the newer part of the very front of our brain. And this system is also going in, and you can see from the arrows here, is regulating a lot of what happens in our emotional system and our reward systems. So this, again, the prefrontal cortex, it's the center for executive functioning. It's well developed in humans compared to animals. And there's a few places in the brain that we focus on when we do imaging. One is the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. So that sits sort of here closer to the midbrain. And when we do fear conditioning, we see something very interesting. We'll talk a little bit about fear, but we see that when a person is first exposed to the fear, the amygdala tends to light up. And after a few times of re-exposing them to this fear, then the ventral medial prefrontal cortex starts to kick in, and it starts to regulate that, and it starts to calm the amygdala down. And so that we can now rationalize and say, this scared me before, but I know it's not going to hurt me that badly. So it kicks in, and then after the initial fear, and starts to regulate that system. Also, the orbital frontal prefrontal cortex is part of this base of the brain too, and that also helps in the regulation of emotions. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So dorsal means towards the back of the prefrontal cortex. Lateral means towards the outside. This is an area that's thought to be involved in inhibitory processes, sometimes in motor inhibition and just inhibition of behaviors that we know that we shouldn't be doing. And when I say these areas are thought to be, this is such a new area of research, trying to localize where different behaviors live in the brain. So research has shown repeatedly that these centers light up when people do these types of tasks. But this is just, still theoretical and just what people think that is true about the brain. So again, executive functioning is required for planning, decision-making, troubleshooting or error correcting, novel sequence of actions, things that we have not rehearsed and that are not set in like an automated process, dangerous or difficult situations, resisting temptation or overcoming habits. So again, with the people who like to elicit their reward system over and over again, and that's a very primitive sort of behavior, then if you want to try to overcome that, you have to resist the temptations, and that would come from your prefrontal cortex in helping you to be able to do that. Okay, attention. So attention is something that can be voluntary and selective, or it can be something that's involuntary. So our voluntary selective focused attention is the top-down process, okay? So that's coming from the prefrontal cortex. That allows us to sustain attention, like all of you are doing today, focusing and trying to pay attention here in class. And you can sustain that attention for minutes and hours. And that voluntary attention is coming again from the frontal lobe. And then you have this involuntary attention system, And that is coming from the bottom-up processing. So that is sort of a phasic or something that happens very quickly. So for example, if we were in here and we heard a very, very loud noise out in the hallway, all of us would immediately look and try to see what's going on. So that's sort of a bottom-up primitive response when our conscious mind changes focus due to a sudden change in our environment. So that's something that's more primitively based rather than, you know, having to actually sit and focus on something. So that's where our attentional systems come into play in the brain. And again, in the voluntary on the left column, top-down brain pathways, it's the result of effort. And it helps us to build self-regulation. Involuntary, which is the bottom-up, it's a response to a stimulus, and it can help us to build a dependence on the stimulus. So if we hear something over and over, we might start getting afraid of it, or we might just start incorporating it into our environment and ignore it. Inhibition is also a prefrontal cortex process, and again, as I mentioned, it's thought to live in the dorsolateral and dorsal-medial frontal cortex. It helps us to prevent motor actions and behaviors, and helps us to inhibit bad habits that we might accumulate that are positively reinforced in our brain. Okay, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So this is thought to be a problem with regulation of control in the brain. So in children and adults, this is difficulty maintaining attention and an impulsive behavior. So this is something that's really become sort of like a popular diagnosis to give to kids in the US. I don't know about here if you have a lot of diagnoses of this, but used to be the kids, maybe were just a little out of control in the classroom, but now they say it's ADHD, and they give them a medication to calm them down a lot of times in the US. So structural differences, there's structural differences from controls, and these differences could be related to delayed development, and they also have seen reduced volumes of gray and white matter in people that have this ADHD, and reduced activity in various frontal levels of the brain, which they would be able to assess using a functional MRI technique. And they also think it may be associated with lower levels of dopamine in ADHD brains. So a lot of times kids who have ADHD will grow out of it as they mature and their brain continues to develop. And sometimes, though, it'll continue throughout adulthood. And a lot of times in those cases, people will learn to compensate and to be able to overcome these things and be able to focus, for example, in a job or something like that. And that is one great thing about the brain. It's very adaptive, especially when you're younger. It can, if you lose functioning in one part of the brain when you're very young, interestingly, sometimes another portion of the brain will take over and allow you to function normally, which is it's a thing called plasticity. So it's the ability to change in response to things that are going on. And once you get older, it's harder to be able to adjust to things like that. Okay, emotions and emotional regulation. It's also called the affective system. Again, this is a lot of takes place in the limbic system, in the amygdala, and the thalamus, hippocampus, hypothalamus. And right above the corpus callosum, there's an area called the anterior cingulate cortex, and that is also thought to be involved in social emotional processing. And this orbital frontal cortex down here in the front of the brain, it's also VMPFC, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, is thought to regulate those emotions. And I gave you that example about fear. So again, in fear is expressed in the amygdala, and it's thought to be regulated by the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. Dorsal ACC, we also see thalamus and hippocampus light up when we expose somebody to fear. So I don't know if you guys know what classical conditioning is. If you've learned any psychology things, you probably learned about Pavlov's dogs, which he would bring the food out and they would salivate, and he eventually showed that they would salivate without, just by like hearing the food noise or something. I can't remember the specifics of it, I'm sorry. But the study that we do, which is not my idea, by the way, but we take participants and we sleep deprive them, and then we put them in the MRI machine and we show them a room on the screen, and a light turns on in the room, and if a certain color comes up, they get a shock on their finger. So first we sleep deprive them, then we shock them in the scanner. So not my idea, not very nice, but we do it. They get paid well for it anyways. So eventually they learn to associate a color with the shock. And so this is a conditioned stimulus would be the color, and the unconditioned stimulus would be the shock. So they learn to associate a color with the shock. And this is called classical conditioning, just like Pavlov and his dogs. They learn to associate, the food stimulus with salivating. And if you have cats, I open a can of soup or something, they all come running because they hear the can opener, and they think they're going to get a tasty meal, even if it's not. So I say, nope, it's a can of green beans. You can have one if you want, but they never seem to want them. So anyways, this classical conditioning is involved also with fear memories. And these can be quite strong, and they have a large bottom-up effect. So fear memories can be really deeply conditioned into our brain. And we also study post-traumatic stress disorder, which is thought to be a dysregulation of this fear. So this is a conditioned fear from a severe trauma. And we see this a lot in veterans who come back from wars and have been involved with a lot of explosions or, very negative things that happen to them. And they tend to get nightmares, flashbacks. They avoid situations where they may encounter these fears, and they have negative feelings and beliefs. It's also characterized by being very irritable, trouble concentrating, and trouble sleeping. So what it's thought to be a failure to extinguish a fear in the presence of safety. So they're so conditioned by this that they're afraid that something might happen. So it's thought to be sort of hyper-arousal of the fear areas in the brain. So they can't relax these areas. They're always on guard for them. And one example I remember, my godfather in the U.S. was in a prison of war camp for 2 years in World War II. And he said they would come in and just start shooting. They were on the they would sleep on the bunks, and the soldiers would come in and just start shooting randomly, and everyone would have to duck down so that you didn't get shot, of course. So when these men would come back from the war, all it would take was to hear a loud noise, and they would immediately drop to the floor. So this is a very classically conditioned fear response that is hard to reverse once it's set so deeply engraved in the brain. Okay, memories. We have different types of memories, so we're going to talk more about memories later. But we have long-term memories and short-term memories. So things end, but memories last forever. We have different types of memories, can be declarative versus non-declarative, episodic versus factual. So you might remember that 2 plus 2 is 4, or something factual like that, which we try to store in our brains and can recall upon command. Or we might remember an incident that happened to us. We also have emotional memory, so you might remember something sad and you can actually stir up that emotional system with this memory and bring it up to the front of your brain again. And we also can develop fear memories too, which I mentioned with the PTSD. Although fear memories can also be a good thing, right? Because if you those that maybe some kind of a poisonous snake you don't want to associate with, so you see that snake and you might shriek and run away as fast as you can, which would be a good thing to keep you from harming yourself. Short-term versus long-term memory. Sensory information is lost very quickly, so we're constantly seeing all these things around us, and our selective attention allows us to focus on what is important in the environment to us. Short-term memory, we can only hold for about 7 items in our short-term memory for about 20 to 30 seconds. There's certain strategies you could try to use to help you remember things. And when I taught in college, I showed these strategies, and I have them here today, but I think we're going to probably talk about them when we talk more about memory systems, since we're getting to the end of our time together today. So important information is gradually transferred to long-term memory systems in our brain. So memory is just such an amazing thing to me. There's so many questions that still remain. Like, for example, where does memory live in our brain? What is a memory? Is it a chemical thing? Is it a synaptic thing, an associative thing between cells? It's just a really fascinating area to me. So in long-term memories can be, as I mentioned, cognitive or declarative, which would be explicit facts or events. They can be information that's stored and retrieved, for example, on exams, history lessons, facts, dates, things like that. And they can be non-declarative, implicit memories, skills, habits, emotional movement memories. If you're good at playing a musical instrument, you might have a good memory of how the notes that you need to play when you're playing a particular piece that you like. It doesn't require conscious thought to recall. It's more of a procedural memory. For example, driving a car or tying your shoe. You can just get in there. You don't have to sit and think, okay, I need to recall these memories to be able to do this. They just seem to be there, and those are the non-declarative types. Okay, here's a little chart of classification of memory systems in the brain. And like I said, we'll go through this in more detail when we get to the memory lecture. So you have the long-term and the short-term memory, and long-term memory can be divided down into declarative and non-declarative, and you can have different types of both declarative and non-declarative that we'll get into. And there's a very interesting case of a man who had his hippocampus removed when he was older. He's a very famous psychology case. His initials were HM, so he was known as HM. And HM, we'll talk about him more later, but he had no memory of things that would happen day to day. So when they would study him, every morning they would go in to introduce themselves over again, because he didn't remember who people were on a day-to-day basis. So I think there's a movie like that, right? For 50 First Dates, yeah. I don't think I've ever seen it. I probably should watch it sometime. But interestingly, HM would remember dreams, and they did an experiment where they would put a little shock device in their hands, and they would go in and shake his hand in the morning, and HM could remember that this response that he would get shocked. So this is clearly a different type of memory system than the one where he would learn names and keep that information intact. Okay, so again, memory is an organism's ability to store and retain information and recall it. Sensory memory corresponds approximately to the initial 200 to 500 milliseconds after an item is perceived. Short-term memory can allow recall for a period of only several seconds to a minute without rehearsal, and your short-term memory has a limited capacity. You can store about 4 to 5 items at a time. And you can practice certain techniques to get better at short-term memory. Long-term memory can store much larger quantities of information for a potentially unlimited duration and sometimes a whole lifespan. And it's thought that the capacity of long-term memory is immeasurable. So you can hold all kinds of long-term memories. And I'm just going to, I think, stop for today here since we're out of time. And so we're going to talk about forming memories, increasing memories, and things like that when we get to the memory lecture. And we're also going to talk about Alzheimer's disease, which is a structural degradation of the brain. I told my mom I would show her what an Alzheimer's brain looks like, and you can see that on the left the normal brains, and on the right how the Alzheimer's disease brain has really eroded away, which is a very sad condition. But like I said, we'll talk about that more when we get to that area of the brain, and that'll be it for today. Thank you all very much for your attention. If you have any questions, I'm sorry I didn't leave a lot of time for questions, but please feel free to ask. Yes?
Okay, the left brain is connected to the right side of the body and right to the left.
Yes.
You see that in the optical system very clearly through the optical nerve.
Yes.
Have people wondered about why this has come about this way? Is there any reason? Is it evolutionary? Is it developmental?
He's asking why the left brain goes to the right body and vice versa. I'm not very sure about that. I can look into that again tonight too, but I find that quite interesting too. It's just so odd that we would, pass the information to the other side of the body. Yes.
You never talked about people being left-handed or right-handed. Does that have to do with the way the brain?
It's thought to be to the way that the brain is oriented. The left brain and the left brain is thought to be more analytical, and the right brain is thought to be more for like arts and types of things like that. But I'm not sure why that is. Why some people are more dominant on the left side and some people are more dominant on the right side. I don't think their brain's in backwards. Yeah, they can be. There are some very unique people that can be both.
As you talked about the reward system, which keeps us motivated or gives us a feeling of happiness.
Yes.
Is it apart from drug abuse, are there many other things which can make us feel motivated or make us feel better, like addiction? That means, are there anything else which can cause addiction?
I think exercise. So when you exercise, you get endorphins released, and this gives us a positive, reinforced feeling of feeling good. That's one thing. I guess people maybe develop their own sort of things that make them feel rewarded too. So that's a good question, though, because it's always good to have that feeling of sort of reward and feeling good about yourself.
Continuing along this question, if you look at the spectrum of personality disorders like obsessive compulsive
Yes.
disorders, these people tend to do repetitive tasks, and that is supposed to have been triggered by anxiety.
Yes.
Dealing with anxiety, so maybe it's a coping strategy at the level of the brain where anxiety triggers repetitive behavior, which in turn connects to the reward system.
Yeah, that's a great point about obsessive compulsive disorder, where you have to repeat a behavior in order to calm your fears about something that's irrationally going on in your brain. So, and th- really, so they chant as a sort of a
I guess
compulsively.
all religions have had some component of chanting doing repetitive things. Maybe that's what she.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. They're saying that a lot of religions have compulsive behaviors that people do to help them feel spiritually connected, or maybe to feel reduced anxiety, or to make them feel that they're spiritually doing what they're supposed to be doing to be rewarded in another life.
In fact, I mean, I have this theory which is, of course, completely irrational, but I have this suspicion at least that if you are slightly obsessive compulsive, then that helps you sustain in academics.
That's a great point. Yeah, people who are a little OCD are more into the academics, because I think having a little bit of obsessive compulsiveness helps to drive you, as long as it's a rational amount and you don't allow that to take over rationality in your brain. So I think you're right. Academics tend to be a little OCD, and they also seem to have other unique qualities. Maybe sometimes good, maybe sometimes not so good. At least in the US and the people that I work with. Yes. Yes, in like for an injury or something. Yes. That I would guess that if you were young enough, that it could definitely do that. Interestingly, when I was a graduate student, I worked in the Department of Neurosurgery, and one thing that they did was they treated children with epilepsy, and epilepsy tends to be a firing of a region of nerve cells in the brain, just sort of uncontrollably. And what they do is then they figure out where these brain cells are firing from, and they go in and take that part of the brain out. And they have removed entire hemispheres of the brain, so the person has one brain hemisphere left. And interestingly enough, if they do that young enough, the person can be fully functional and have a normal life. So, which I think is pretty amazing. They can take out hippocampus in children, and these people can still go on and learn to develop memories. So the brain is really an amazing thing and can compensate for a lot of things. It'd be great if we knew how, so we could try to do that with other things. Right. How does it know to do that? I have no idea. It's such an amazing organ. It really is. Yes. Right. So she's asking why people sometimes can remember things better in a written form, or dates better, or some people have better spatial memory. That I'm not sure of. I think maybe some of it comes with practicing those systems and developing those systems. But that's a great question. Yes. Yes. Oh, she's asking about when you block memories or shut them out. That I'm not sure about either. It's definitely some sort of survival compensation methods to maybe sort of a self-protection so you don't dwell on that. But that's a great question. Maybe I'll look into that and try to address it a little bit when we get to the memory portion. And also your question, Surabhi, about the why some people have better memories for things than others. Yes.
So in general, we are able to recollect or reimagine or simulate probably visual and auditory memories or stimuli better than chemical or chemosensory or stimuli.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah.
How is that so?
That I'm not sure about either. He's asking why we can sort of remember more spatially in auditory, like hearing and seeing memories better than we can like a smell memory or something like that. So that I'm not sure about either. But it's definitely a good question. Memories are such an interesting thing, and you know, a lot of times our recall of things that happened is adjusted in our minds to actually think what we remember, and it's not actually factually what we remember. We've done a lot of like interviewing of people through the years in the studies that we do, and some of them, even over time, the things that they will recall and tell us can change from year to year too. So it's pretty interesting. Yes.
Why do some people have different memories of the same incident?
It has to do with just the way that our brain constructs it and the way that we recall it. So, yeah, so maybe the same event, two people will remember it differently. And this can be a problem, as you can imagine, like for forensics and criminology, that people actually believe that they did see something. Maybe it's not factual, so it's hard to remember. I mean, it's hard to decipher which is the true memory because, you know, unless, of course, you record it on a camera or something that has the perfect memory and it doesn't stray from what actually happened. We tend to perceive things the way that we perceive them and remember them in the way that suits us in our brain. Yes?
Regarding since we are talking about memory,
Yeah.
all of us undergo an experience called as deja vu. That means we see something and then we realize, oh, I have seen this somewhere.
Yeah.
So how does brain work in that case?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm not sure. He's talking about deja vu and thinking, I think I've seen this before. So that's really interesting. I don't know if it's something beyond what we understand about the brain, maybe something more spiritual or sensory oriented that we don't fully understand. Yes.
You said that brain teasers are good brain topic. Can you elaborate this?
A brain talk.
Teasers.
Brain teasers? Yes, brain teasers or practicing memory will help you to improve it because the brain, when you do something repeatedly over and over again, it sort of develops a better infrastructure for doing that again and again. For example, if you play an instrument, your brain will start devoting more of your brain, of the cells, you know, in your brain to that certain skill. So it's part of our adaptiveness that is pretty amazing in the plasticity. So they say that if you practice memory and things like that, it can help you from having dementia when you get older. So. Okay.